Thanksgiving dinner was supposed to be about gratitude. Instead, it became the day my family demanded I hand over $15 million to my sister. And I shut the door in their faces forever. My name is Charlotte, and for 30 years I've been invisible to my own family. Not because I wasn't there. Oh, I was always there. I was the one polishing antiques in the back of our family shop while my sister Jessica got piano lessons. I was the one working weekends and holidays while she pursued her dreams of Broadway stardom. I was the one they called antique shop girl, like it was some kind of joke, some limitation that defined my entire worth as a human being. But here's what they never saw coming. That quiet girl surrounded by dusty treasures. She was building an empire. Let me take you back to where it all started. I was 12 years old when my parents, Robert and Linda Morrison, first handed me that feather duster and pointed toward the Victorian armoire in the corner of Morrison's Antiques. "Charlotte, honey, can you clean this up? We've got customers coming." Even then, I knew. Jessica, who was only 10, was upstairs practicing violin because God forbid she get her hands dirty. She was going to be something special, they said. She was going to make the family proud. And me, I was going to dust furniture. "But I have homework," I remember saying that first day, clutching my math textbook against my chest. Dad barely looked up from his ledger. "The shop is your real education, Charlotte. Jessica's got the brains for academics. You've got good hands for this work." Good hands for this work. Even at 12, those words cut deep. Not smart hands, not talented hands, just good enough for manual labour. That weekend turned into every weekend. Then after school, then summers. While other kids my age were at camps or hanging out with friends, I was learning the difference between Georgian and Victorian silver, memorising the value of depression glass and watching my parents' faces light up whenever a customer complimented Jessica's natural charm during her brief appearances in the shop. The pattern was set early. Jessica was the star. I was the stagehand. When I turned 16, I asked my parents if I could apply for a job at the mall. Just something part-time, maybe at the bookstore. I wanted to earn my own money, maybe save for college applications. Mum looked at me like I'd suggested burning down the shop. "Charlotte, we need you here. Besides, most teenagers would kill for the kind of business experience you're getting." "But Jessica doesn't work here," I said quietly. Jessica has different talents," Dad interrupted, not even looking up from the estate jewellery he was cataloguing. "She's going to conservatory next year. You know how expensive that is?" I did know, because while I was working 40 hours a week in the shop for free, Jessica was getting private voice lessons that cost more than some people's rent. While I was learning to spot authentic Tiffany lamps, she was being groomed for greatness. The summer before my senior year, something happened that should have been wonderful, but instead became another reminder of where I stood in the family hierarchy. Jessica, then a sophomore, landed a small role in the community theatre's production of Our Town. Not even a leading role. She played Mrs. Webb, maybe 20 lines total. But you would have thought she'd been cast on Broadway. The night of the performance, our entire extended family showed up. Aunts, uncles, cousins I hadn't seen in years. They filled 2 entire rows at the little theatre downtown. Dad even closed the shop early, something that had never happened for any of my school events. I sat in the audience watching my sister deliver her handful of lines, and I felt something break inside my chest. Not jealousy exactly, something deeper. The realization that no matter what I accomplished, no matter how hard I worked, I would always be background noise in my own family's story. After the show, during the reception in the theatre lobby, I overheard a conversation that I've never forgotten. I was standing near the refreshment table, holding a plastic cup of punch, when Aunt Margaret sidled up to Mom. "Linda, you must be so proud of Jessica," she gushed. "Such talent, and Charlotte's doing well too, I'm sure." Mum glanced over at me, and for just a moment I thought she might actually say something nice. Instead, she smiled that tight smile I knew so well. "Oh, Charlotte's been such a help with the business. She's got a real knack for the practical side of things. Not everyone can be an artist, you know. Someone has to keep the books and dust the inventory. Someone has to keep the books and dust the inventory." That's when I knew I wasn't their daughter who happened to work in the family business. I was their employee who happened to share their DNA. The college application season that followed was a masterclass in family favoritism. Jessica, still a sophomore, was already being courted by conservatory programs. Admissions counselors called the house asking about her interests. Dad researched the best music schools in the country. Meanwhile, I filled out my applications alone at the kitchen table after closing the shop at 9 p.m. When I asked Dad about college funds, he frowned like I was asking for something unreasonable. "Charlotte, honey, you know money's tight. Jessica's conservatory costs are going to be substantial. And honestly, with your involvement in the business, do you really need a degree? You're already getting the best education possible." "But I want to study business administration," I said, "maybe marketing. I have ideas about how we could expand." "The shop's been doing fine for 25 years, Mum interrupted. "We don't need to fix what isn't broken." That conversation happened on a Tuesday night in November. I remember because the next morning, Jessica bounced into the kitchen with an acceptance letter to a summer music intensive that cost more than my entire college application fee budget. "Isn't it exciting?" Mum practically glowed as she read the letter. "Our little star is going to study with professionals." I congratulated Jessica. I always congratulated Jessica, and went to open the shop. But as I unlocked the door that morning, I made myself a promise. I was going to prove them all wrong, not by fighting for their attention or begging for their approval, but by succeeding so completely that they'd have no choice but to notice. I just had no idea how completely that success would change everything. The day I graduated high school, there was no party. Jessica had a recital that afternoon, some spring showcase for her voice teacher's students, and naturally that took precedence. Dad handed me my diploma at breakfast like it was a grocery receipt. "Cool, congratulations, sweetheart," he said absently, already reading through auction listings in the paper. "Mrs. Henderson is bringing in her mother's china collection today. I'll need you to catalogue everything. No cake, no celebration dinner, no proud parent photos. Just another day at Morrison's Antiques." But I did get something that day that changed my life forever, though I wouldn't realise it for months. Hidden in a box of estate jewellery that Mrs. Henderson brought in was a small, unremarkable bracelet. Silver, tarnished black, with what looked like glass stones. Dad glanced at it and tossed it in the costume jewellery bin. "Probably worth $5 at most," he said dismissively. Something about that bracelet nagged at me. The weight of it felt wrong for costume jewellery. The construction was too delicate, too precise. That night, after everyone had gone home, I stayed late and examined it under the magnifying lamp. The hallmarks were tiny, almost invisible under the tarnish, but they were there, European silver marks, and those glass stones, they caught the light in a way that glass never did. I spent 3 hours researching that bracelet online. What I found made my hands shake. It was a 1920s Art Deco piece by Georg Jensen, set with genuine aquamarines. Conservative auction estimate, $1,200. Dad had been ready to sell it for $5. That bracelet taught me something crucial. My parents didn't know everything. Their expertise had gaps, big, profitable gaps. I bought that bracelet from the shop inventory for the $5 Dad had priced it at. Then I listed it on eBay for $900. It sold within 3 hours. For the first time in my life, I had money that was truly mine, money I had earned not through wages or allowance, but through knowledge and skill that my parents didn't possess. That $900 became my seed money. Every week, I'd scour our inventory and the estate sales we attended, looking for pieces that were mislabeled, undervalued, or overlooked. A reproduction Roseville vase that was actually authentic. A silver-plated tea service that was solid sterling. A modern painting that turned out to be a genuine mid-century original. I was careful. I never took anything worth more than what my parents were asking for it. I paid the shop's asking price for everything fair and square, but I was developing an eye that saw value where others saw clutter. And slowly, quietly, I was building something of my own. By my 20th birthday, I had $15,000 in a private savings account. By 25, it was $50,000. I was still living at home, still working in the shop, still being called antique shop girl at family dinners. But behind the scenes, I was becoming something my family couldn't imagine successful. The real turning point came when I turned 28. Jessica's acting career had stalled after graduation. She'd moved to New York with such fanfare, such excitement, but the callbacks never came, the roles never materialized. After 3 years of waiting tables and going to auditions, she moved back home, bitter and defeated. Suddenly, there were 2 adult daughters in the Morrison house again. But the dynamic hadn't changed at all. It's temporary, Jessica announced at dinner on her first night back. Just until I figure out my next move. Maybe I'll try Los Angeles. Or maybe I'll go back to school for something practical. The way she said practical made it sound like a dirty word. Mum immediately started making plans. You can have the guest room, of course. And Charlotte, maybe you can give Jessica some shifts at the shop while she gets back on her feet. I looked up from my plate. Give her shifts? Well, you practically run the place anyway, Dad said. It would be good for Jessica to learn the business side of things, broaden her skill set. I had been working at that shop for 16 years. 16 years of cataloguing, pricing, buying, selling, managing inventory, handling customer complaints, processing estate acquisitions. I had essentially been running Morrison's Antiques since I was 22, when Dad's back problems started limiting his involvement. And now they wanted to just share it with Jessica, who had never shown the slightest interest in antiques and had openly mocked my work for years. I think I'll start my own place, I said quietly. The silence that followed was deafening. Mum actually laughed. Your own place? Charlotte, honey, this business takes years to build. Decades of relationships with dealers, knowledge of markets, capital for inventory. You can't just start an antique shop from scratch. Besides, Dad added, This shop will be yours someday anyway. Why compete with yourself? But I wasn't talking about someday anymore. I was talking about right now. That night, I called a realtor. Within a week, I had found a small storefront 3 towns over. Far enough from Morrison's Antiques to avoid direct competition, but close enough that I could still live at home while I got started. The lease required first month, last month, and a security deposit, total $4,000. I wrote the check that afternoon. When I told my parents about Charlotte's collections that weekend, their reaction was exactly what I expected. Concern mixed with condescension, worry wrapped in doubt. It's a nice hobby, Mum said carefully, but don't put too much pressure on yourself. If it doesn't work out, you'll always have a place here. A hobby. My life's work was a hobby. But Jessica surprised me. For the first time in years, she looked at me with something that might have been respect. That's actually really cool, Charlotte, she said. I mean, scary as hell, but cool. I could never take a risk like that. It was such a small thing. But hearing her say that meant more to me than I wanted to admit. For just a moment, I thought maybe things were changing. Maybe my success could bring us closer together instead of driving us further apart. I had no idea how wrong I was. Charlotte's collections opened on a rainy Tuesday in March. I had spent 3 weeks arranging the inventory I'd been accumulating for years. Pieces I'd bought and stored in a rented storage unit, investments I'd made with my eBay profits, carefully chosen items that I knew would sell quickly to generate cash flow. My first customer was a woman looking for depression glass. I sold her a complete jadeite dinner service for $350. A piece I'd bought from an estate sale for $40 2 years earlier. My second customer bought a pair of Art Deco bookends. My third customer purchased a Victorian jewellery box. By closing time, I had made $700 in sales. Not bad for a rainy Tuesday in a town where most people had never heard of me, but the real validation came 3 months later when I received a call from an estate attorney in the state capital. A wealthy collector had passed away, and his family wanted to liquidate his collection quickly and quietly. Did I have the expertise and capital to handle a significant acquisition? I drove 2 hours to meet with them that weekend. The collection filled a 4-bedroom house: furniture, artwork, pottery, silver, jewellery, books, textiles. Everything carefully preserved and documented. The family wanted it gone within 60 days. I spent 6 hours going through everything, calculating values, making notes. When I finally sat down with the attorney to discuss terms, my hands were shaking slightly. I can offer $120,000 for the entire collection, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The attorney nodded. That's considerably higher than the other offers we've received. When can you arrange pickup? I had just committed to spending more money than my parents made in 2 years of running Morrison's Antiques. And I was 28 years old with a shop that had been open for 3 months. But I knew that collection was worth at least 3 times what I was paying for it. I knew I could move the pieces strategically over the next year and double my investment, maybe triple it. I liquidated my entire savings account, took out a business loan against my shop's inventory, and borrowed against my growing stock portfolio. 2 weeks later, I rented a moving truck and drove back to the capital. It took 4 trips to move everything to a climate-controlled storage facility I rented specifically for the acquisition. For the next 8 months, I sold pieces from that collection steadily, carefully, profitably. When the dust settled, that one estate purchase had generated over $400,000 in revenue. After expenses, taxes, and loan repayments, I had cleared nearly $200,000 in profit. I was 30 years old and I was wealthy. Not wealthy by billionaire standards, but wealthy enough that I never had to worry about rent or groceries or whether I could afford to replace my car. Wealthy enough to reinvest in bigger acquisitions, better inventory, prime real estate for additional shop locations. And my family had no idea. To them, I was still just Charlotte, still the antique shop girl who had opened a cute little shop as a hobby. They never asked about my finances. They never inquired about my business growth. When I moved out of the family house and into my own apartment, they assumed I was barely scraping by. "Make sure you're putting money away for emergencies," Mum would say during our weekly family dinners. Small businesses can be so unpredictable. If only she knew that by that point I was putting away more money each month than Dad earned in a year. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 28 years, I had been desperate for their attention, their approval, their recognition. Now that I had achieved success beyond anything our family had ever seen, I found myself oddly protective of their ignorance. Because as long as they didn't know about my money, I could still pretend that their love wasn't conditional. I could still hope that someday they might value me for who I was rather than what I could provide. I should have known better. Money has a way of revealing people's true nature, even when they don't know it exists yet. But I was about to learn that lesson in the most painful way possible. By my 32nd birthday, Charlotte's Collections had grown into something I never could have imagined when I signed that first lease. What started as one small storefront had expanded into a network of 7 locations across 3 states. I had 43 employees, a climate-controlled warehouse facility, and an online presence that generated 6 figures in monthly revenue. But the real game changer came when I met James Mitchell. I was at an estate auction in Connecticut, bidding on a collection of 18th century American furniture, when a distinguished man in his 60s approached me during the preview. "Excuse me," he said, extending his hand. "James Mitchell, estate attorney. I couldn't help but notice your expertise with the Chippendale pieces. Are you a dealer?" "Charlotte Morrison," I replied. "Yes, I have several shops in New England." His eyebrows raised slightly. "Morrison, as in Morrison's Antiques? I know your father's shop." "That's my family's business," I said carefully. "Mine is Charlotte's Collections." We ended up sitting together during the auction. James was representing a client who was liquidating her late husband's collection, and he was impressed by my knowledge and bidding strategy. When I successfully acquired a Philadelphia highboy for $30,000, a piece I knew was worth at least $50, he handed me his business card. "Ms. Morrison, I work with a lot of high net worth individuals who need to liquidate assets quickly and discreetly. Your reputation in the antique community is quite impressive for someone so young. I'd like to discuss some opportunities with you." That conversation led to the most lucrative 2 years of my career. James connected me with families who needed estate liquidations handled efficiently and professionally, old money families who valued discretion above profit margins, collectors who had acquired pieces over decades and needed someone who understood both the financial and emotional value of their treasures. Each acquisition was substantial. Each sale generated profits that I had never dreamed possible. By the time I turned 34, my business was generating over $2 million in annual revenue, and my personal net worth had crossed the $15 million threshold. $15 million. I owned real estate in 4 states. had investment portfolios managed by 3 different firms, and enough liquid assets to retire comfortably if I chose to. I was, by any reasonable measure, wealthy enough that money would never be a concern again. And my family still called me the antique shop girl. The disconnect had become almost surreal. At family dinners, Mum would slip me $20 bills for groceries, while I sat there knowing I had more money in checking accounts than they had in their retirement savings. Dad would offer to help me with business advice, while I nodded politely, thinking about the acquisition deals I was negotiating that involved more capital than he'd see in a lifetime. Jessica, meanwhile, had settled into a pattern of perpetual disappointment. After the failed New York experiment, she'd tried Los Angeles for 8 months. When that didn't work out, she moved back home again and started talking about finding herself and exploring different creative outlets. What that actually meant was that she worked part-time at a local yoga studio, took pottery classes, and spent most of her energy complaining about how unfair life was to people with real artistic souls. "It's just so hard," she'd say during family dinners, usually while I was clearing the table. "The world doesn't appreciate authentic creativity anymore. Everything's so commercial, so shallow." I'd nod sympathetically while mentally calculating the profit margins on the Meissen porcelain collection I'd acquired that week. The cognitive dissonance was becoming unbearable. I had achieved success beyond my wildest teenage dreams, but I was still playing the same role I'd been assigned at 12 years old. The practical daughter, the one who helped with cleanup, the one whose real life was invisible to her own family. It was James Mitchell who finally forced me to confront the situation. "Charlotte," he said during one of our quarterly business meetings, "I need to ask you something, and I hope you won't take offence." "Of course," I said, looking up from the estate documents we'd been reviewing. "Do you have proper estate planning in place? Wills, trusts, beneficiary designations?" I felt my cheeks flush. "I have a basic will." "Basic will?" His expression grew serious. "Charlotte, you have a $15 million net worth and a rapidly growing business. If something happened to you tomorrow, do you understand what that would mean for your estate? For the taxes your heirs would owe?" The truth was, I hadn't wanted to think about it. Planning for my death meant acknowledging the reality of my wealth, and I wasn't ready for that conversation with my family. "More importantly," James continued, "have you considered what would happen if your family discovered your net worth while you're alive? With assets of this magnitude, there are legal protections you should have in place, financial privacy measures, asset protection strategies." "You think I need protection from my family?" I asked, though even as I said it, I felt a chill of recognition. "I think you need to be realistic about human nature," he said gently. "I've seen too many wealthy individuals struggle with family members who suddenly become very interested in their well-being once money enters the picture. Not saying that would happen in your case, but preparation is prudent." That conversation haunted me for weeks. James was right, of course. I had been living in a fantasy where I could maintain my wealth in secret indefinitely. But secrets have a way of surfacing, especially secrets involving millions of dollars. The irony was that I had spent so many years desperate for my family's attention and approval. Now that I had achieved something worthy of both, I was terrified of their reaction. But the decision was taken out of my hands by the most mundane circumstance imaginable. a mistake by my accountant's assistant. It was late October, just 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, when I received a phone call that changed everything. Ms. Morrison, this is Linda from Hartwell Financial Management. I'm calling about the quarterly statements we sent to your home address last week. What about them? I asked, distracted by the catalogue I was reviewing for an upcoming auction. Well, it seems there was a mail mix-up. The statements were delivered to Morrison's Antiques instead of your current address. Your father called this morning asking about them. The catalogue slipped from my hands. What did he say? He was quite confused, actually. He said there must be some mistake because the statements showed assets of over $15 million. And surely that couldn't be for his daughter, Charlotte, who runs a small antique shop. My mouth went dry. What did you tell him? I couldn't confirm or deny any account information, of course, client confidentiality, but he was quite insistent that I explain the error. After I hung up, I sat in my office, staring at the phone for 20 minutes. 34 years old, $15 million in assets, and I felt like a teenager who'd been caught sneaking out of the house. Dad didn't call that day, or the next day, or the day after that. The silence was worse than confrontation would have been. I knew he was processing the information, probably researching, maybe consulting with Mom and Jessica, trying to figure out if it could possibly be true. By the following weekend, I couldn't stand it anymore. I drove to my parents' house on Saturday morning, ostensibly to drop off some apple butter I'd bought at a farmer's market. The kind of thoughtful gesture the old Charlotte would make. Mum answered the door with a strange expression I'd never seen before. Not angry exactly, not happy either, something calculating. "Charlotte, honey," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "How nice of you to visit." Dad was sitting in his recliner reading the newspaper, but I could tell he wasn't actually processing the words. When he looked up at me, there was something different in his eyes. A kind of evaluation, like he was seeing me for the first time. "Hello, sweetheart," he said carefully. "How's business?" "Business is good," I replied, settling into my usual spot on the couch. "Good," he said, folding the newspaper. That's really good to hear." The conversation continued like that for another 10 minutes. Careful, polite, loaded with subtext. Nobody mentioned the financial statements. Nobody asked direct questions. But the dynamic in the room had shifted fundamentally. I was no longer the daughter who needed guidance and support. I was someone they were trying to figure out. Jessica wasn't there that day. She was at some weekend retreat about creative manifestation that Mum had paid for. So I didn't have to navigate her reaction yet. But I knew that conversation was coming too. As I drove home that afternoon, I realised that James had been right. I did need legal protections, not just for my assets, but for my sanity. The next few months were going to test every relationship I had, and I needed to be prepared. I called James that Monday morning. "I want to set up that estate planning we discussed," I said, "and I want to talk about asset protection strategies." "Of course," he said, "but Charlotte, can I ask what changed your mind?" My family knows about the money now," I said, "or at least they suspect. And I have a feeling Thanksgiving is going to be very interesting this year." James chuckled, but it wasn't a happy sound. "In my experience, family holidays and sudden wealth revelations don't mix well. Let's get you protected before you need to be." Over the next 2 weeks, James helped me restructure my assets in ways that would protect them from potential claims or disputes. We established trusts, created legal entities, and put safeguards in place that would preserve my wealth regardless of what happened with my family relationships. It felt like preparing for war, which should have told me something about what I was expecting. The call came on Tuesday before Thanksgiving. Mum's voice was artificially cheerful, the way she sounded when she was trying to manipulate a situation. "Charlotte, honey, we're so excited about Thanksgiving this year. Jessica's been looking forward to it for weeks." "That's nice," I said cautiously. "She's been having such a hard time lately, you know. The creative life is so challenging. But she's got some wonderful new projects starting, and she's feeling really optimistic about the future." I waited. Mum never called just to chat about Jessica's mood. "The thing is," Mum continued, "she's been working so hard on herself, really growing as a person. And I think it would mean a lot to her if we could make this Thanksgiving extra special. You know how much she appreciates your cooking." "Of course I'll cook," I said. "I always do." "Oh, wonderful. And Charlotte, there's one more thing. Jessica mentioned that she might want to talk to you about some opportunities she's been exploring. Business opportunities. You've done so well with your little shop, and she thought maybe you could give her some advice." There it was, the setup. They had figured out that I had money, and now Jessica needed advice about business opportunities. "I'd be happy to talk with her," I said, though my stomach was already knotting with dread. "Perfect. Oh, and Charlotte, maybe don't mention to Jessica about, well, you know, the financial statements mix-up. We don't want her to feel awkward asking for help. You know how proud she is. Don't mention the $15 million, right?" I hung up the phone and stared out my office window for a long time. In 3 days, I would be sitting around the same dining room table where I'd eaten thousands of meals as the invisible daughter, the helpful one, the antique shop girl. But this time, I would be sitting there as a multimillionaire. And for the first time in my life, my family was going to pay attention to me. I should have been excited. This was what I'd wanted for so long. Recognition, respect, acknowledgement of my success. Instead, I felt like I was walking toward my own execution. Thanksgiving morning dawned cold and grey, which felt appropriate for what I was expecting to unfold. I arrived at my parents' house at 8 a.m., arms full of grocery bags and pie boxes, just like every year. But everything was different now. Mum hugged me a little too tightly and held on a little too long. Dad actually helped carry groceries in from my car, something he hadn't done since I was a teenager. And Jessica, who usually slept until noon on holidays, was not only awake but dressed and helping in the kitchen. "Charlotte," she exclaimed, rushing over to embrace me, "I'm so glad you're here. I've been looking forward to spending time with you." In 34 years, Jessica had never once said she was looking forward to spending time with me. The morning proceeded with a surreal quality of forced normalcy. I cooked the same dishes I'd been making for years: turkey with sage stuffing, mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, cranberry sauce from scratch, pumpkin and apple pies. But instead of being ignored while I worked, suddenly everyone wanted to help, to chat, to be involved. "This smells incredible," Jessica said, stirring the gravy I'd taught her to make. "You're so talented in the kitchen, I never realised." "You know," Dad said, carving the turkey with unusual attention to detail, "I was thinking we should have Charlotte cater the family Christmas party this year. Professional quality food." Professional quality, as if my cooking had somehow improved overnight. By the time we sat down to eat at 2 o'clock, the tension in the room was so thick I could have cut it with the carving knife. Everyone was being too nice, too attentive, too interested in my opinions about everything from the weather to the football game playing on the television. We made it through most of the meal with this bizarre charade of heightened family harmony. I answered questions about my business with carefully vague responses. I complimented Jessica on her recent pottery pieces. I listened to Dad's stories about customers at the shop with the same polite interest I'd shown for 20 years. But as I was serving dessert, Jessica finally dropped the pretense. "Charlotte," she said, setting down her fork and looking directly at me, "I need to ask you something, and I hope you won't think I'm being presumptuous." Here we go, I thought. "I've been doing a lot of soul-searching lately," she continued, "really examining what I want to do with my life. And I keep coming back to this amazing opportunity I heard about." She paused dramatically, as if she were delivering lines from a play. "There's this incredible acting intensive program in London. 6 months of training with some of the most respected coaches in the world. It could completely transform my career." I nodded politely. "That sounds interesting. The thing is," Jessica went on, "it's quite expensive. $50,000 for the program, plus living expenses." "I know that's a lot of money, but Charlotte, this could be my breakthrough. This could be everything I've been working toward my entire life." $50,000. She was asking me for $50,000. "I was hoping," she said, her voice taking on a pleading quality, "that maybe you could help me. I know you've done well with your shop, and I would pay you back, of course, with interest, once my career takes off." The silence that followed felt eternal. I could feel Mom and Dad watching me, waiting to see how I would respond to this perfectly reasonable request from one sister to another. Reasonable if I actually had $50,000 to spare. Reasonable if this wasn't obviously a setup based on their discovery of my real net worth. Reasonable if Jessica had ever shown the slightest interest in my success or well-being before this moment. $50,000, I said slowly, is a lot of money. "I know it is," Jessica said quickly. "But Charlotte, you of all people understand what it's like to pursue your dreams. Look at what you've built with your antique business. You took a risk and it paid off beautifully. And we're so proud of you," Mom chimed in. "So proud of how successful you've become." Successful, past tense. As if my success were a recent development rather than something I'd been building for over a decade while they ignored it completely. "The thing is," I said, looking directly at Jessica, "I'm curious about something. Why now? Why this particular program?" Jessica blinked, clearly not expecting questions. "Well, I've been researching intensives for months, and this one has the best reputation." "No," I interrupted gently. "I mean, why are you asking me now? Why today?" The question hung in the air like smoke. I could see the calculation happening behind Jessica's eyes, the quick mental scramble to come up with an answer that didn't reveal the truth. "Because it's Thanksgiving," she said finally. "It's a day for family, for helping each other. And you're family, Charlotte." Family, now I was family. I set down my coffee cup and looked around the table at the 3 people who had shaped my entire life. My parents, who had never asked about my finances when they assumed I was struggling. My sister, who had never once inquired about my business success until she needed money. "You know what's funny?" I said conversationally. "For years, I dreamed about sitting at this table and having you all really see me, really understand what I was capable of." "We do see you," Mum said quickly. "We've always seen you." "No," I said, still speaking in that same calm tone. "You haven't, but you're about to." I reached into my purse and pulled out a folder I'd brought, not planning to use it, but knowing I might need it. Inside were copies of my latest financial statements, business valuations, and asset summaries. Jessica, you asked me for $50,000 for your acting program, I said, placing the folder on the table. I want you to know that I could give you that money. In fact, I could give it to you right now, today, without it affecting my financial situation at all. Their eyes were fixed on the folder like it contained state secrets. I could give you $50,000, I continued, because I have $15 million. The words hit the dining room like a physical force. Jessica's mouth actually fell open. Dad's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. Mom made a small gasping sound. 15 million, I repeated. Not 15,000, not 1,500,000. $15 million. Jessica was the first to find her voice. That's not possible. I opened the folder and spread the papers across the table, right next to the pumpkin pie and whipped cream. Bank statements, investment portfolios, business valuations, real estate holdings. The documentary evidence of everything I'd built while they called me the antique shop girl. Charlotte's Collections currently has 7 locations and generates over $2 million in annual revenue, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. I own commercial and residential real estate in 4 states. I have investment portfolios with 3 different management firms. I am, by any reasonable definition, wealthy. Dad leaned forward, squinting at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. How is this possible? It's possible because, while you all assumed I was playing store with my little hobby business, I was actually building an empire. While you worried about my finances, I was out-earning everyone at this table combined. While you saw me as the daughter who needed guidance and support, I was becoming more financially successful than our family has ever been. The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't the loaded quiet of unspoken knowledge. This was the stunned silence of people whose entire understanding of reality had just been shattered. Jessica was staring at the financial statements like they might disappear if she looked away. "You have $15 million, she said, as if testing how the words sounded. "I do. And you've had this money for how long?" "I crossed the $1 million mark about 5 years ago, multiple millions about 3 years ago. 15 million was reached 8 months ago. And you never said anything." This from Mum, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would I?" I asked. "When have any of you ever asked about my success? When have any of you ever been interested in my accomplishments?" "But we're your family," Dad protested. "Are we?" I stood up, looking down at the 3 of them. "Because family members don't ignore each other for decades and then suddenly become interested when money appears. Family members don't dismiss someone's life work as a cute hobby and then demand financial support when they discover it's actually worth millions." Jessica's expression was shifting from shock to something else. Something that looked like hunger. Charlotte, wait," she said, reaching for my arm. "I know this is a lot to process, but think about what this means. Think about what we could do together. I could restart my career properly, get the training I need, really make something of myself, and you could help me do it." "You want me to fund your dreams?" I said. "I want us to be a real family," she said desperately. "Sisters who support each other." I looked at her hand on my arm, then back at her face. "Jessica, where were you when I opened my first shop and was terrified I'd fail? Where were you when I was working 18-hour days to build my business? Where were you during any of the years when I could have used support and encouragement?" "That's not fair," Mum interjected. "We've always supported you." "You've always supported Jessica," I corrected. "You've tolerated me. I gathered the financial papers back into their folder, my hands surprisingly steady. But here's the thing, I said. I can give Jessica $50,000. In fact, I can give all of you more money than you've ever dreamed of having. I saw the hope flicker across their faces, the sudden visions of what my wealth could mean for their lives. But I'm not going to. The hope died instantly. Charlotte, Dad started, I'm not going to give you money because for 34 years, you've made it clear that I don't matter unless I'm useful. I've been the daughter who works for free, who cooks the meals, who handles the practical details, while Jessica gets to be the star. I moved toward the door, then turned back. You want to know the truth? I've spent years hoping you'd love me for who I am, rather than what I can do for you. Now I know the answer. That's not true, Jessica said, standing up so quickly her chair almost tipped over. Charlotte, I do love you. We all do. You love my money, I said. There's a difference. And with that, I walked toward the front door. Behind me, I could hear chairs scraping against the floor as they all stood up, could hear their voices calling my name, pleading with me to wait, to reconsider, to come back and talk this through. But I didn't stop. I opened the door, stepped onto the front porch and closed it behind me with a soft click that somehow felt louder than any slam ever could. I had spent 34 years as the invisible daughter in that house. I was never going to be invisible again,